A single priest nearly dismantled Christianity from within, and he did it without armies, persecution, or violence. He used 6 words so dangerous that an emperor burned every copy of the book containing them, and bishops literally came to blows over them. There was a time when the sun was not. That was Arius' slogan. 1700 years after his death, we're still arguing about what he got wrong. Born around 250 AD in Libya, Arius came from Berber descent and grew up in Alexandria, Egypt, which at that time served as Christianity's intellectual capital. He studied under Lucian of Antioch, a celebrated Christian teacher and martyr so influential that a later Russian historian called him the Arius before Arius. By 313 AD, Arius had earned ordination as a priest and received assignment to the Baucalis Church on Alexandria's waterfront. By all accounts, he impressed everyone. An ascetic, a man of pure morals, a persuasive speaker and gifted poet who attracted massive crowds. So what did this devout, charismatic priest say that shook the entire Roman Empire? His famous slogan offered a clean, rational answer to Christianity's greatest puzzle. Christians had always worshipped Jesus Christ as divine, but they hadn't precisely defined what that meant. Arius stepped into that gap and argued that if God the Father begat the Son, then the Son had a beginning. If the Son had a beginning, then he wasn't eternal. He was created, the first and greatest of all God's creations, certainly, but still a creation. As Arius himself wrote, the Son is not equal to, nor is he of the same being as the Father. This wasn't some fringe position. Historians Guido Berndt and Roland Steinacher noted that Arius's beliefs were not especially unusual and seemed acceptable to huge numbers of Orthodox clergy. That's exactly why it became such a crisis. Between a quarter and a third of the church's bishops either agreed with Arius or sympathized with him. In 318 AD, Arius publicly challenged his own bishop, Alexander of Alexandria, and the controversy erupted. By 320, Alexander had convened a council of over 100 bishops from Egypt and Libya, and they formally condemned Arius. But the condemnation didn't stop anything. It accelerated everything. Arius had powerful allies. Chief among them was Eusebius of Nicomedia, a fellow student of Lucian who happened to be distantly related to the imperial family and deeply influential at court. Then Arius did something genuinely brilliant. He wrote a book called the Thalia, which means festivity or banquet. It mixed prose and verse, summarizing his theology, and he set the poems to popular melodies, songs for sailors, songs for millers grinding grain, songs for travelers on the road. He was writing pop music to spread theology. Ancient sources tell us he seduced the minds of the unlearned by the attractiveness of his songs. Athanasius, his greatest opponent, was so offended he accused Arius of imitating the dissolute and effeminate tone of Sotates, an ancient Greek poet notorious for obscenity. The controversy grew so fierce that it caught the attention of the one man who could do something about it, Emperor Constantine. Constantine had just unified the Roman Empire. He did not want a theological dispute tearing it apart again. His first instinct was to treat the whole thing as trivial. He sent letters to both Alexander and Arius, calling their disagreement a question of no practical importance, and advising them to simply agree. He clearly didn't grasp what was happening. When the dispute refused to die, Constantine took an unprecedented step. He summoned every bishop in the empire to a council. He invited all 1,800 of them. Somewhere between 220 and 300 actually showed up to the imperial summer palace at Nicaea, in what's now northwestern Turkey, for what we call the First Ecumenical Council. Constantine's chief advisor on Christian affairs, Hosius of Cordova, presided over the council's deliberations. It opened on May 20th, 325 AD. Here's an irony that often gets lost. Arius himself wasn't allowed to speak at the council. He was only a priest, not a bishop. The man at the center of the entire controversy had to sit in silence while others debated his ideas. And debate they did. The council needed a formula, a creed, that would settle the question once and for all. The key word they chose was homoousios, a Greek term meaning of the same substance. The Father and the Son weren't merely similar as the competing term homoiousios suggested they were of one being, one substance, co-eternal. The difference was literally a single Greek letter, an iota, but it determined whether Christ was God or merely God's greatest creation. Eusebius of Caesarea, the great church historian who chronicled these events, recorded the intense theological debates. By the time the council concluded in late August, all but 2 of the attending bishops had sided against Arius. He was declared a heretic. He was banished to Illyricum. Constantine ordered every copy of the Thalia burned. There's a famous legend about what happened during those debates. The story goes that Saint Nicholas of Myra, yes, the historical figure behind Santa Claus, became so enraged by Arius's arguments that he crossed the room and slapped him across the face. It's a fantastic story. It's also almost certainly fiction. There's no ancient evidence for it whatsoever. The first written account doesn't appear until 1370, more than 1,000 years after the council, when a bishop near Venice mentioned Nicholas striking a certain Arian in the jaw. Still, the legend endures, because it captures just how visceral this theological conflict was. But here's the thing about Nicaea. It didn't end the controversy, not even close. Within just 2 or 3 years, Constantine reversed course and recalled Arius from exile. Powerful Arian sympathizers like Eusebius of Nicomedia worked the political angles, and the emperor's position shifted. Meanwhile, Athanasius, the young Alexandrian deacon who had championed orthodoxy at Nicaea, became Bishop of Alexandria in 328, and spent the next decades as the church's fiercest defender of the Nicene position. For his trouble, he was exiled 5 separate times by 4 different emperors over the course of 17 years. By 335, the Synod of Jerusalem had formally restored Arius to communion. Constantine ordered a solemn ceremony of reinstatement to take place at the Cathedral of Constantinople. Everything was arranged. Then, on the eve of his rehabilitation, Arius died. The circumstances were dramatic enough to become legendary. As the 80-year-old priest marched triumphantly through the streets of Constantinople with his supporters, he was suddenly seized by some kind of abdominal crisis. The ancient historian Socrates Scholasticus recorded that a terror arising from the remorse of conscience seized Arius, followed by a faintness, a bowel prolapse, and a fatal hemorrhage near Constantine's forum. His supporters saw tragedy. His opponents saw divine judgment. A modern medical journal analysis identified the likely cause as rectal prolapse, with possible gut ischemia due to strangulation. Some modern scholars have suggested a more sinister explanation: poisoning by his opponents. In a final indignity, Athanasius later recorded that a wealthy Arian purchased the latrine where Arius died and had it torn down, so that the foul memorial might be forgotten. Constantine himself died just a year later, in 337. The Arian controversy raged on for another 44 years. Emperors Constantius II and Valens actively supported Arian or semi-Arian positions. It wasn't until Emperors Gratian and Theodosius took up the defense of Nicene theology that the tide truly turned. The Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD made Nicene Christianity the official state religion. The First Council of Constantinople in 381, attended by 150 bishops, condemned Arianism once and for all. Yet, Arianism lingered in Gothic and Vandal kingdoms in the West until the 7th century. The historian Harnack judged that if Arianism had won, it would have ruined Christianity completely, leaving it an empty system of cosmology and ethics stripped of religious meaning. Others argue the difference between the two positions was remarkably small, but that small difference determined whether Christ was God or merely God's greatest work. That distinction shaped the next 17 centuries of Western civilization. In 2025, we're marking the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. Pope Leo XIV and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew's joint pilgrimage to Turkey marks the first papal patriarchal visit to Nicaea since the Great Schism, a historic moment of Christian unity. The World Council of Churches organized a full year of commemorative events. For the first time in years, Eastern and Western Christians celebrated Easter on the same date. 1700 years later, the creed that Nicaea produced is still recited in churches around the world every single Sunday. The question Arius asked, the question that nearly broke Christianity apart, is still the question at its center: who was Jesus Christ? The answer the church gave at Nicaea echoes across 17 centuries. But it was never inevitable. The man who forced the question was a Libyan priest who wrote pop songs on the docks of Alexandria. Nicaea didn't just condemn Arius, though. It attempted something no religious body had ever done before. It tried to force 300 bishops from across the known world to agree on who God is. How that meeting actually unfolded, who showed up, what really happened in those debates, and why its decisions still govern Christianity 1700 years later, that's coming up next.